Hello, everyone. I'm Satanya Fair. I'm the president and CEO of Peak Grant Making, and I'm really excited to welcome you to Advancing Equity throughout the grants lifecycle. I am going to be moderating the session today. Welcome to Upswell 2022. If this is your first session for the day, we know that there's more goodness in store. And if you're already deep into a couple, I'm glad that you selected ours. And so we have a quick poll. We wanted to find out kind of who's here and who's around. So I'm counting on the event staff to help us launch a quick poll. And this is really as by way of like introduction chat, getting to know kind of what you're thinking, what's on your mind. We'd love to give you a couple of minutes to answer the following question. And the question is, when do you expect the sector to start using a common grant application? I'll repeat that. When do you, from your vantage point, expect the sector to begin to accept that we're going to use a common application form? So we're going to launch a poll. Hopefully you all are able to see that poll. Event staff, I'm queuing up. Drum roll, drum roll, drum roll. And I'm trusting that the poll is launching. And with that, I'm going to ask you to advance to the next slide. Awesome. Well, again, I'm Satanya Fair, and I'm really excited to be joined by two friends in the field and in the sector, John Moore, who is our Chief Information Officer from the MacArthur Foundation, and Ann May Chang, who is the new-ish CEO of Candid. And so welcome, John, and welcome, Ann May. So good to have you all here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Satanya. Great to be here with both of you.
Yes. And so by way of just introduction, I'm going to say a little bit about me, and we have a little bit of grounding that we want to provide for everyone. And I'll get around to like going and looking at the results of the poll in like a few seconds. But for myself, Peak Grant Making is an organization that works very closely with the two entities represented here and with many folks in the sector. And especially, we're especially proud to be an independent sector member. Our work that we try to do every day is to advance equitable practices for the sector. And so we are going to, by way of a few very simple questions, we're going to move from point A to point B to a call to action. And so to get us started, I'm going to begin with my colleague, John. And the question is really like, why are you here? I'd love to hear you share with the folks that have joined us how you have come to be in this place in philanthropy at this moment, and also to share a little bit around the Philanthropy Data Commons work that you've been doing. So, John, I'm going to pass it to you, and then John will pass it to Ann May.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So although my title, as listed here, is Chief Information Officer, I'm here today as a co-steward of the Philanthropy Data Commons project. That project intends to center change makers in the grant making process and reduce the burden on them, both in terms of time and effort. Yes, I do think our current processes are not efficient and do waste time. So I'll do a quick overview of the PDC. So it's a sector-wide collaborative project, as it says here, focused on the collection, integration, standardization of data, and as I mentioned, intends to reduce the burden on organizations seeking grants and funders. So it's not fundamentally about technological information. It's about using existing technology to organize and make data and information available in the right places at the right times for the right purpose. And one of those areas is in the application stage. So grant makers already have ways of doing business. And while we want to improve, we don't expect those grant makers to immediately make changes. We want to meet them where they're at. We also recognize that change makers should own and control their own information. So we are interested in creating a new way of governing, sharing data and information, and utilizing that as a sector asset. Another key principle is to make change makers central and center and recognize that power imbalance and work to adjust that. We do want to reduce the burden on change makers in the life cycle process, and ultimately and at scale, when there is a volume and broader sharing of data, increase access to capital. And we believe that would have the potential to transform how the sector operates. Next slide, please.
Next slide, please.
Thank you. So our efforts actually started in 2021 in a proof of concept, and then in 2022, we moved into a pilot stage. And you can see here the participants in this pilot, and this represents change makers, grants management system providers, data platform providers, and funders. The pilot for this year launched in March and is intended to run through December. And the goal of this pilot is twofold. One is to develop and test the viability of a data commons, which would allow the interoperability and use of data to deliver common data and information elements in the grants application and grant award lifecycle. The second is to design and develop a collaborative governance framework intended to demonstrate a different way of managing, using, and governing data and information in the sector. So how we're doing this work is critical. What we're doing is modeling and building a collaborative governance approach. And we think that is different and distinguishes this effort from what has happened in the past. And we believe then has the opportunity to create an enduring solution. Can you go to the next slide, please? I want to comment that though this project was initiated by the MacArthur Foundation, we recognized from the beginning it was necessary to include stakeholders from across the entire sector in co-creating the solution. Individually, none of us in this virtual room and at this virtual conference have all the answers of what the PDC should be, but we are building it together and learning together. We're intentionally moving fast for philanthropy. We're building on the urgency and momentum that currently exists in the sector. So this slide is a high-level overview and representation of how the PDC can work. On the left-hand side is a modeling of the current way, and the right-hand side is an example of how this can work in the future. So currently, most funders use a grants management system. There is a number of commercial offerings, Flux, Smart Simple, Foundin, et cetera, et cetera. And change makers access those systems for a variety of tasks, for applications, for reporting, communication with the funder. And they share that data with each funder and their GMS individually. They take this approach because the different grants management systems don't talk to one another. Change makers are responsible for entering and maintaining their data across a variety of platforms and organizations. Sometimes it's a half a dozen, sometimes it's more. And it can feel very duplicative, and it is. Each GMS system and each funder may require different information or slightly different information, all of which then increases the administrative burden on the change maker. But through the PDC, we can lessen this burden and move data across the systems and platforms, increasing accessibility and reducing time and effort. So the data sharing would be happening behind the scenes without adding a new system for change makers or funders to log in and update. And most important, the change makers control what data to share and when. You can think of the PDC as the interconnection of the entire ecosystem. It operates behind the scenes to help drive forward towards greater impact. I know that's a lot there, but looking forward to this conversation, and over to you, Anne-May.
Thank you, John, and thanks to Tanya. It's so great to be here with both of you. Two of my closest colleagues in the sector. This is such an important topic for us to be talking about. Just to take a step back, as many of you know, Candid was born about 3 years ago through a merger of GuideStar and Foundations Center, and it created the most comprehensive source of data in the social sector. And so we're 100% aligned on solving this important problem. I just believe we all have to get serious about addressing the unreasonable burden we're placing on nonprofits to repeatedly share data in different forms and with different questions for grant applications, grant reporting, demographics, and beyond. And so this is at the core of our Data 1X vision. And as John showed earlier, we are also an active member of the PDC pilot. And we see this collaboration with PDC as a great opportunity to explore some of the gnarliest challenges that we admit at Candid we just don't have good answers for yet. And three of them that rise to the top is there a way to make high quality data freely available and also be financially sustainable in the long run? The second is, how would a shared governance model work, and how can we make it work in this highly diverse sector? And the third is, and maybe the most important is, can we materially reduce the burden on nonprofits purely by sharing existing data without changing longstanding funder practices? Or is there a way that we can get funders to get on board and really make some changes themselves to better harmonize? And so our hope is that in working with the PDC, that if we can find good answers to these questions together, that we can adopt them at Candid and that our efforts over time are going to converge. So if we go to the next slide, in the meantime, what we're doing at Candid is taking more of what I think of as a bottoms-up approach. We're building on the data, the platform, and systems we already have in place today that enables nonprofits to share their information one time using Candid's GuideStar profile. And we've decided to start our initiative on this with demographic data for a few reasons. One is we've just seen a huge rise in demand in the last few years for demographic data, and there's just no existing solution in place. What that's meant is that we're seeing tragic inefficiency and burden placed on nonprofits with so many funders, associations, and others coming up with different questions, formats, and categories to ask about demographic data, and then taking that data and then locking it up in their own silos. And the third is that demographic data is foundational to our collective work on equity. If we want to get serious, we need to know where we stand, be able to see where the gaps are, and be able to track our progress. So the good news is that we have a solution that's live today, being used by many major partners, and we already have demographic data from over 45,000 nonprofits. And now we're building on this momentum to launch a national campaign called Demographics via Candid to collect demographic data that can be freely accessed and reused by all, whether you're a funder, association, a researcher, or media. We go to the next slide. What we want to do is ask everyone who's looking for demographic data about nonprofits to request that data via the Candid GuideStar profile. So it can be shared one time. The nonprofit can share that demographic data one time. When it needs to be updated, they can update it one time, and then have it be reused by everyone who's looking for it. And we really see this as a public good, and we're committed to offering free access to our demographic data through multiple channels, whether it be a flat file, free APIs, visualization dashboards, or through your GMS vendor. And over time, our hope is to use this as a starting point to build on this work with demographic data, and over time add more and more of the data that's commonly requested in grant applications and grant reporting, so that ultimately we can be building towards a common grant application and common grant reporting. And we see this as building that virtuous cycle, that we want to make life easier for both grant makers and nonprofits, while shifting the power imbalance by placing more of the onus on those requesting the information rather than the nonprofits who really should be focused on their mission. Thank you. Back to you, Satonya.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm going to have ask our organizers to advance to the next slide, but I do want to pivot for a second. For those of you who are able to see the poll results, thank you for casting your vote. Talk about an interesting dynamic here. So I'm ready now at about 36%. Within the next 2 years, 29%. More than 5 years, 7%, and it's never going to happen. And you naysayers out there, it's never going to happen, 29%. So this is really interesting. And I would love, so I'm going to ask John and Ann May to just sit with that for a second, because I do think that that's going to come up in our comments. I'm here because of my deep participation and appreciation for the work that you two are doing as individuals, but also your organizations. And so when I start to think about this, we're going to spend about the next 20 minutes or so. We're going to dig into some areas of discussion, because both of you have talked about power, you've talked about process, and moving into a new way of thinking. And so one of the things we'd love to hear a little bit more, and Ann May, I think I'll pivot right back to you, is like, when we think about the collective we, the sector, and the roles that each of us have to play, whether funder, nonprofit, or part of the philanthropy supporting or infrastructure organizations, when you think about like, where are we supposed to be, kind of positioning ourselves when we think about the road ahead? So I want to pivot you away from why you're here, which is beautiful to hear, and why are we here? What should this sector be focusing on most of all right now when we think about advancing equity?
Great questions, Tanya. I mean, I think this is something I wake up every day thinking about, right? That we're here to make the sector work better. And a big, important piece of making the sector work better is equity. And I think the reason we're talking about this topic in particular and how it connects to equity is, we're placing an inordinate burden on nonprofits in the way that they have to interface with funders and others that really takes away from their work. That actually ends up being sort of a competitive advantage for those large established nonprofits, because they can have whole departments that field all these funder requests. Right. And so what that means is that those smaller community-based nonprofits, who are often BIPOC-led, are at a real disadvantage because they just don't have the staff. They're like barely making it, trying to deliver on their mission. And they don't have the staff to field all those requests. They don't have the time to answer that next demographic survey, to apply for 100 grants. And so they have to be much more selective. And it means that they get less funding. It means they are able to have less resources to do their work. And so if we can reduce the burden of and it's not just grant applications. I think I want to put grant reporting on an equal playing field, because I think that that is equally a burden that we're placing on nonprofits, is trying to report data in all these different ways to all these different funders. But both those things take up so much time for organizations, and I really think it disproportionately impacts those organizations that are most disadvantaged to start with.
Absolutely. And thank you for threading that. When we talk about application process, we are not talking about just that first step. When we think about it, the grant is a component of the larger process. So we often, even in our preparation for this, we're talking about the reporting process and the things that come behind, the site visits, all the things. So the application process is where we're starting, but it's not, our viewpoint is much broader, because we know that as a funder goes into thinking about moving funds out to a nonprofit, a university, or a government agency, any of those things, they're also thinking about how they will stay connected, what will be required. And as you said, Ann May, if I'm giving away a 5-year, grant, I might be asking that organization to come back to me annually to update demographic data, to update on their inputs and their outcomes. And so I just thank you for naming that. And I want you all to just expect to hear that we will be referring to what we see as more of a global process that gets you funds and allows you to possibly be in good standing to get more funds on the application process. And so this power that we speak of, and our goal to really think about the fact that organizations that don't have that bandwidth, thank you, Anne May, to even get through the basic process, Candid has shared with the community that on average, nonprofits are reporting 20 to 40 hours per application. And that's real data that's coming from your team to the sector. And I wish that more people kind of heard that and knew that information just from the start. And so, John, I'm going to pivot awkwardly to a large funder.
Excellent.
MacArthur is a large funder. And when we talk about the power dynamics that are at play, there can be perceived that funders have all the power. I know that is not MacArthur's standpoint. I know you all have worked very hard behind the scenes and in front of the scenes and in community to show that you are coming in as a partner. But when we start to think about how through the application process that power dynamic shows up, how exactly are you, why are you getting excited about the PDC yourself as moving funders in a new direction?
So it was interesting seeing the results of the survey, and I think I think personally I am an optimist. So of course I think that we can make a difference here and get to something that is more common. But sort of reflecting in the past few years, and I think MacArthur is aware, but is also been part of this system, and so we I think we should recognize and own that. And I know from the CEP survey how long our application takes, and it is on the right end of that that range. And and that is I don't know, intolerable, frankly. But just as examples of the kind of change that can happen, MacArthur was a leader in the indirect cost initiative, right? And so that was a significant change. During the pandemic, we did a number of things with our grants management processes. We accepted verbal reports, right, and eased the burden there. We're working on something called a GenOp No App, right? So if it's a general operating grant, to really streamline that application and frankly just use a Candid profile. That should be sufficient. I mean, so there are those kinds of things, and that is in addition to the Philanthropy Data Commons topic that we're talking about, that that MacArthur is doing, and we're also looking at other things in the life cycle, right? And you mentioned that in the application. Well, let's also consider due diligence, right? It's, I think maybe from a liability or a risk management perspective, it's probably always a little easier to add another question, but we really need to ask ourselves, is that best serving the change makers? And is that really, what we need to do to have the impact we want in the sector? So there's a variety of different things that can be done, including the PDC. So I think there's a lot of different efforts that fit together and are complementary, that have us working towards making this process more equitable, and then first off recognizing the power imbalance and then working to change that.
Absolutely.
If I could jump in here, I just was going to say, I think it's the question about when we can get to a common grant application is very much tied in with this question of, will funders pivot to more general operating support? Because a common grant application is going to be much easier if what you're doing is general operating support, right? If you have to describe a program and all the outputs and the dates and the budget and so forth, that's going to be much more custom. And so if we can have, if more and more funders move to general operating support, which I'm strongly supportive of, that we trust, we do our due diligence in an organization and we trust them to invest in the best ways because they're closest to the work. Then I think a general grant application is very feasible, right? Because then it is, the Candid profile plus, right? We can expand and get more information that people are looking for and capture at one time, and it's less custom, right? Because it's a general operating support grant. And I think Mackenzie Scott has set a great example here, right? She has gone out and done all her own due diligence. We were very fortunate to get one of those grants. And we weren't asked to apply, right? She did her due diligence. She used our Candid profile. She used the resources that were out there. And then I think we got a couple, minor questions of information that wasn't publicly available. And then, we received the grant. And so I think it's a model that shows that it's possible and shows what that might look like.
Absolutely. And I think that it's important to note, I want to give some kudos to MacArthur as a grant recipient of the organization. I know that along the way we had some questions. And what I also think when I think about advancing equity is being okay with sitting with a nonprofit that says, thank you, I have some feedback. And MacArthur invited a conversation with myself and my COO with their team to just learn, how did you receive the application process? How did we move the money? And I will just say, for all the work that I know that MacArthur is helping lead around PDC and other things, what I think goes unnoticed maybe and maybe unmentioned, so I'm bringing it up as a grantee, is like, thank you for being open to me being transparent that there were components. I consider myself to be an expert on grant processes. Peak, that's what we do. But I have been in this field a long time, giving and receiving the money. And I will say that it felt like I was being heard, that my team was being heard. And then we were also informed that the process would be changing moving forward. So that responsiveness is also the key. I think if we've got other funders who are on the line with us, and you have the ability at any time to say, we heard you, we can do something differently. Yes, there are big projects that are trying to tee up a different way of moving that money along, to Ann May's point, but also relationship. John, you mentioned it, Ann May, you've mentioned it. When we are in relationship with an organization who we have funded before, the process should be different anyway. You should have built some trust that allows your technology and some other things, right, John, to step in and maybe take away some of the process because the relationship you have is already strong.
Yeah.
I just want to plus one that we just went through the MacArthur GenOps NoApp process, and it was fantastic. Love it.
Excellent. That's something we've been working on for a while. I want to add that, what we're talking about, certainly there's technology behind it, but like, it's a systems issue. We talked about trust, right? I think recognizing and respecting the change makers in this process. An interesting point, going back to the poll, there are some common applications that are in existence, and they tend to be very focused. There are some that are within a specific geographic area in a county. I think it's in Maryland. There's another that has an arts focus, and so that's something we can learn from. Like, if there's a narrow scope and a specific body of funders and pools of applicants, that can happen, and it can happen right now, and it is. I think the challenge and interesting wrinkle for us is to figure out how to make that work at scale. And to that, I want to, just as I think about Ann May's opening remarks, there is a ton of overlap, and I'm just like doing the +1+1, and I think we're approaching this like in a very collaborative way, with the ultimate goal of providing benefit for the sector. And I think that kind of partnership and working together is really key to figuring these thorny systems kinds of challenges out.
And also, I mean, the thing I think that's the beauty of Candid too is that I don't think we should get through this time without saying transparency matters, right? And the other thing that I think is really interesting, Peak is fortunate enough that we have a website, that we've had the resources to build out our website, and we are on Candid. And so I will say that there is work to do for us to think about what process a nonprofit receives and how responsive and open we can be to feedback. But I will say that there's this really interesting plus side on being a funder who also has transparency. I think nonprofits are just as interested in knowing who wants to offer them money as funders are interested in knowing who the nonprofit is. And so I just want to say that when you do utilize these tools, the ability for you to get in front of other funders, other folks becomes even easier. And so I think for the PDC, we have to rely on our large funders sometimes to really start a trend, a ripple effect. And I know for Candid, for Peak, we're watching trends, and we're just trying to find, Ann May and I are like, where do we find our moment to jump in, to amplify, to support? And this was a moment. But also I will say Peak is amplifying what Candid is really trying to do on sector transparency, and also have relationships with your nonprofits that allow you to be nuanced in your process. I think that's what resonates so deeply for me, Ann May, when I really look at the broad work that Candid is advancing. And I just don't know if you want to comment a little bit about that and how you feel, again, it changes the equity game when you get that part right.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is small nonprofits often can't put together a website, or particularly a beautiful, full functional website, right? And I think the stat is something like only 10% of foundations have a public website. I don't know if that's exactly right, but it's a very small number. And so it's hard to find each other, right? And when you don't know how to find each other, again, people resort to the old networks, which, not everybody is plugged into. And so, like, we really think of this as leveling the playing field. Like on Candid, every funder, every nonprofit has the same profile. Think of it as LinkedIn, right? Like everybody, every professional I know has a profile on LinkedIn. And when people are hiring, they look on LinkedIn for all those resumes. Everybody's looks basically the same. It's nicely formatted. It has the same consistent way of presenting information. And it's a great leveler of the playing field, right? You don't have to have a fancy web designer to create your own website. And it allows everyone to be surfaced for someone who's hiring. And same thing on the employer side. All the jobs are available, are surfaced. And so I'd love to see one day, if I could have my dream, is one day the sort of grant application and matching process is like the job hunting process, right? There's a lot of analogies there where everyone can have their information available. We can look, both sides can look for each other to make matches, and be able to have consistent data openly available and transparently available so that we can make the best decisions.
Absolutely. And I think, Wiz, I think about the PDC and like the tie-in as Candid as Peak are both nonprofits who are able to participate. I think that was huge. You all invited in not just funder voices, but nonprofit voices. And so I just would say, what did you hear, John? I'd love to have you just share a couple tidbits on what you heard that really made like this difference of saying, no, we have to do this. We have to start somewhere, because you all are now moving into the next phase of the project. And some of us, like Peak and Candid, are still going to be involved as not an echo chamber for things, but actually giving you all feedback on what we're hearing from the field. So what resonated for you all as you involved both nonprofit and foundation voices in those conversations?
Yeah. So we started with the use case around the beginning of the life cycle, right? The application. And, in that, we heard frustration and extra and additional time. And I'll add, I'm really glad and pleased to see the leadership around DEI information, because that's another area where, some change makers have said, I've been asked this like 12 different times in 12 different ways. And, that's an example where if there can be, a common definition that works for the sector, that is going to be so beneficial. But the application phase didn't resonate for everybody. Some referred to the reporting as the holy grail. And that was much, much, much more onerous. Others mentioned impact. So those are certainly viable use cases. I think I just lost my train of thought.
You were talking about the use cases that you all discovered as you were going through the process.
Yeah. uh, transparency is another, and so that's around like before I start an application, I want to know what the entire application is like.
Mhm.
And then, right, so that you have a sense, is this a 20-hour application, a 30-hour application? And through that, funders and the grants management providers have added that functionality to make it easy to say, when you're applying for a grant, this is the application you're going to need to fill out, including the character limits, which is always sort of a hot button. Often there's too few characters and seldom too many. So that's another area as well. And then back to reporting in terms of transparency is that can be quite onerous. So, the change makers thinking about their entire life cycle and their commitment, in terms of what they need to do to make good on that grant. And in some cases, some change makers have said, this funder's requirements are so onerous, we don't actually want that grant. And that's, that is stunning and, says a lot. That's just not right. But that absolutely exists.
And if you happen to be a funder who listens to this recording later and you've ever heard that, it's just time to go to work. I mean, that's all. The whole point is not shaming foundations in your process. I do think that there's a thread, as we were preparing, there's a thread of conversation that came up is like, I have worked for large institutions. And it is not lost on me that people's entire jobs are built on some of the barriers and processes that we have created. There may be someone in your office, their job is to do the 2 or 3 check runs every day. Now, some people would say, why are you doing that? There's someone else who's sitting there doing the report forms and making sure that the report forms that the program officer wants are selected and sent out. Like, we absolutely understand that we're in a human field. People do this work. And that the reticence sometimes to think about common, simple, gen op, streamlined as a way of advancing equity is not because any one person doesn't believe that we should be trying to do that. But we have not always done a great job of explaining how people's roles may shift as we get to better, more equitable processes. So I don't know, Anne May or John, if you want to share about that, because I would think at MacArthur, I know at other orgs, I've talked to folks who said, it was so important for me to say to my grants team, there's more than enough work for you to still do, but some of these things that you did do, you're not going to do those anymore. Yeah. And that conversation became the heart of how they were able to actually go to change management. And so Anne May and John, I would invite you just to comment on that, because we can't just be saying, just only do general operating or do away with all of your process. These are people's jobs and also their value within the organization has also been sometimes aligned with some of the processes that maybe a nonprofit says are onerous. I know that has come up in our conversation in our prep, so I just wanted to give you all opportunity to comment on that. And then we do have a couple of questions that are coming in, so I am monitoring those.
Yeah. I'll sort of start with and again, with a career in technology, concerns that when technology comes in, it adjusts jobs and roles, right? And we can think about the relative modernization or digitization of the grants management process, applying online and, either entering data through a web browser or uploading documents, right? And thinking back, and honestly, it wasn't that long ago, maybe a decade, which honestly is a little reflective of where the sector is in terms of its sophistication and use of data. There was concerns about, well, part of my job is this paper folder with the 7, the 7 files in it, and we've got to have 7 files in the paper folder. And if we don't have, how do we do grants management, and I think the point there is that there are so many other value added tasks, right? And ways to better serve the change makers that we can be doing. We can think about, better communication. I mean, another thing we've heard is that communication is often one-sided, and it feels like, there's sort of a black hole, and there's an opacity, and you can't understand what's happening, within the organization. And that, like in a modern tech parlance, like that's user experience.
Yes.
So maybe parts of grants management and grants administration is focused on the user experience with those change makers.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think adds value, and and the other things can happen either in a streamlined or more automated way, or just be reduced, and some unnecessary activities just go away.
Absolutely. And right, holding on to the old for the sake of it is really not what any of the three of us are proposing. And I think that's not what the sector needs. But like you said, if we are moving away from transactional to transformational, we can find many, many more transformational based things to do, tasks, tactics that we need staff to deploy. So Anne, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that as well. And then I'm going to pivot to a question.
Yeah, sure. So, before I was even born, my understanding is that Foundation Center was publishing, these tomes in libraries of directories of all the grants that were being given out by foundations, right? And so we as an organization have evolved over decades. And I agree with you that it's not that people's jobs go away, but that people's jobs change. We're living in a society where change is happening faster and faster. And I think one of the key assets that any staff member can have is the ability to be able to change and pivot with the technology, with the times and so forth. And, that's just become an essential part of the workplace is you no longer expect to do the same job when you graduate college all the way through when you retire. The world is just changing faster than that. And I think generally for the good, but not always, right? I think as change happens, there's always going to be progress in some places, but it's going to leave gaps in others, and we have to be mindful of that. I mean, Candid, we think about this in terms of, accessing our platforms, right? Like Foundation Directory, not everyone's able to afford to pay for that, right? So we are providing ways that people can access that by going to a library and getting free access at their local library. Or if they're a smaller nonprofit, we have a Go for the Gold promotion that if you have a nonprofit with under $1 million of revenue, if you share your data with us by earning your gold seal of transparency, we'll share Foundation Directory, the data we have in Foundation Directory with you. And so I think we always have to be mindful of the ways that advancements open up new opportunities, but also create new gaps.
Absolutely. And for all of those of us who really are excited when we get to be a part of change and transformation within our organizations, that's exciting times. But you also, Peak's central, the folks that we talk to more than anything are grants managers and associates and grants directors. Yeah, I want to encourage folks to not be the obstacle to change either. Because even inadvertently and hesitating on opportunities, when MacArthur Foundation was moving $2 million in a social bond during the pandemic, everybody, and I mean, having talked to John Palfrey and many of the staff members, including you, John, Liz Kane, others, everybody needed to pivot to move that money.
Yeah.
Period. And the process was not the goal. It was being responsive to like a world on fire. And in that moment, you do have to just sometimes move away. But then when the crisis seems to be done, that inertia, that movement back to the center of where you have been happens. And so we all have to fight that. And it's natural to feel like you want to go back to the way things are always done. But as those of us who've worked in tech for a long time and worked in philanthropy for a long time, that's also the scariest phrase we ever hear is this is the way we've always done.
I was thinking about that today, actually, that, during, the time of the pandemic and the racial reckoning, like the responses and the pace and the changes that we made, I mean, collectively, were significant. And I feel like we're at this moment where like we can take that and keep pushing forward. And as you're saying, there's this, and I don't know if it's human nature or tendency to say, all right, let's go back to normal. I mean, normal isn't okay, right? We need to do more, and we need to improve and have a stronger impact on the sector. And I think that's the challenge and frankly, I think the promise of the kind of collective work we're engaging in. And I think that's
absolutely.
Sorry. I was just going to say, and the pandemic was tragic in so many ways, and at the same time, that massive crisis around the world that affected everybody in every aspect of their lives really shook up a lot of the business as usual. One of the things that I was really excited to see was the pledge that over 800 foundations made to make funding more flexible. And so I feel like we're in a moment now as we're transitioning out of the crisis mode of the pandemic, where it is that opportunity. Are we going to revert back to, the old normal, or are we going to capitalize on some of the learnings and opportunities we saw as we made these necessary pivots to move into a next generation of what's possible? And so I'm hoping that, that we all collectively can seize this moment to move us forward, to learn from, all the positive experiences we had when funding became more flexible, when there was a more collaborative relationship by necessity, because we're all flying blind, but to apply that to less crisis prone situations as well.
Absolutely. And what's done in a crisis, communications professionals always say, don't miss the opportunity of crisis, right? It's a crisis. We can all let's go capitalize in the most positive ways on what's happening here. The pandemic, we joke that nobody pays attention to the grants managers at a foundation until there's a pandemic. And then all of a sudden, the whole idea of how quickly can we move money became, the peak community really came together. I'll say that. We came together in every possible way that we could do it. Just say, hey, my board wants to do this. My staff wants to do this. What can we do? Who's done it? Who's already done it? Who's on this tech? Oh, you've done it? Okay, let me get on a user call with you or your person to help you get through it. So the pandemic was also a time where if you were reflecting on your competencies and performance for 2022, right? Being adaptable, flexible, nimble, right? That would be a positive. It must be the same thing that when, for a grant process, if we're going to be moving toward advancing equity, we need to be responsive to feedback. We need to be nimble. We need to be communicating with our nonprofits and the communities they serve and opening up feedback loops for them. But that same agility, flexibility applies to process. And I think that's so important. John is actually at the Technology Association of Grant Makers right now. I am at the Council on Michigan's Foundation, where they're talking about people-powered philanthropy, technology, the role of technology in the field and in the sector right now. Candid, I feel like Anne May, I've seen so many pictures of you at different people's things. I feel like you are on a real transformational roadshow for the sector. So
I'm meeting John in San Antonio in a couple days.
So we're all on this thing. So I do think there was a question that I'll just say there was a shout out to Mackenzie Scott, and we know that not everybody has billionaires resources to go do what she did, which was get Bridgeband to Vetasaw. But I will say that with a few small investments, I know I have been really working with my board to say that Peak's infrastructure as a nonprofit should be better, and that anything that anyone will ask us in a grant application should be available on our website. And if we're not comfortable with that, we probably shouldn't be in the business that we're in. And so I will say where transparency and some adaptability will get you is that Peak recently, and this is not a humble brag, this is just real, because we're on Candid and because we decided to move everything from a conflict of interest, board of directors, everything we're doing, our initiatives, it's all on the website. We were recently contacted where someone said, you don't need to give us anything because everything we needed was on your website. The only thing we lacked was an easy ability for someone to download our 2022-23 budget. With that, we were awesome. And a grant came to us. And so I know that there are funders right now. MacArthur and the large funders that are part of PDC is amazing. But there are small and large funders, corporate, family foundations, who are all in this kind of spirit of adaptability right now. And it has been really joyous to be at Peak and hear what people are trying to do on oral reporting and just all kinds of different ways of doing business. And so I think that equity is getting advanced. I think we have a responsibility to come back and tell a collective story. And so I want us to really get into, there was a question with regard to MacArthur Foundation, which I think is a great opportunity to remind everyone that the majority of funders are by invitation only. What MacArthur did was change the process. So, John.
Yeah, I do want to answer that question, the one from Amanda about the information about GenOp, NoApp. So there's good news and bad news. Maybe the bad news is there's nothing available on the website because it's currently in a pilot phase. So, but that doesn't mean we're not doing it. And actually, as we go into 2023, 100% of our GenOp grants will use that process.
Excellent.
So, also, and hopefully this is on the good news side, Satonia, members of our grants management team hope to present at Peak and share that process next year. So we definitely want to, share that. I wanted to add that. So I'm at the TAG conference, and like the two themes I'm hearing are about collaboration and using data in more powerful ways, which is really interesting. And it sort of fits in with what I think is this moment we're at where, whether it's, the participants in the sector all saying, we're going to collaborate. I mean, there was a panel of grants management vendors that 4 years ago you would not have seen, right? Because they were competitive, and, they're working together in different ways to support the change makers, which is really exciting to see. And again, a reason to be optimistic.
Absolutely. And just very specifically, there are some of us who are really challenging the tech vendors. An organization like Peak, you have more than 500 foundations. We're using all the tech. Like, there's no tech anything. We're using all the tech across our member orgs. And so Peak is very tech agnostic in the sense of just wanting to understand how it's used. But I will say that there is a call to action to tech vendors to build equity into the process. The whole kind of idea that MacArthur or even a small family foundation is having to ask for or pay for collection of demographic data because you didn't bring it as part of your shelf is interesting to me, especially given that this is not a new trend. This is something we've been talking about for many years around the importance of kind of understanding that what you say you fund and where you fund ought to be backed up by data. And so I will say that just as we attend the tags, we have colleagues there with John, and we do have to challenge everyone in the sector, all of us. And so I want to ask you all about a call to action. And what's your advice? Because we want to walk away. We have a few minutes as we finish up. And Julie, I'm reading your comment while I listen to John May and Ann, so I could John and Ann May, so I can respond. John May, this is new. You guys I've combined you.
That's collaboration for you.
Right. Our squares are gonna slide together.
I love it. So, I mean, what's our call to action? Because we want to give people some practical, tangible things to walk away with that they can go take back to folks outside into the next session. So, Ann May, I want to start with you. Where do we go from here? What's our call to action?
Yeah, I think we always need to remember to start with the nonprofits and the experience of the nonprofits. Start and end there, because at the end of the day, they are the ones doing the work. We're all just supporting them to be able to do the work. And so if you're a funder, I would say, use something closer to this GenOp NoApp process. Use the Candid profile to get information that you need, and limit what you're asking from nonprofits. We can add more to the profile, but let the nonprofits do the work that they're best suited to do, and take on some of the burden of doing that research yourselves. And if you're a nonprofit, share your data. Just as Tanya said, share your data on your website, share your data on your Candid profile, so people can find you and so people have the information they need and don't put that burden on you. I just think on both sides, if we can be transparent and use the data that's available, we can just reduce a lot of this unnecessary work that's only taking away from serving all of our missions.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I think we should expect more. I mean, so we should expect more of funders. So frankly, more of ourselves. We should expect more from our technology partners, other participants in the ecosystem as well. And like part of the going back to the why am I here is that we're interested in change, and so we want to raise the visibility on that and increase the momentum broadly around changing that power imbalance and improving the experience for change makers, which Anne May started her comments with, which is absolutely right on the mark. And there's a number of different ways that it can happen that I think are complementary as well. So I think we need to be trying all of these different efforts to move the sector forward.
And we want everyone who hears this message or a similar message to feel like they can lead the change. I think that is where like Peak comes in, is that we are trying to just build an ecosystem of more than 6,000 people who I say, you are hired, you are there, regardless of your title. You must have some expertise, something that you are bringing to the table. Well, you can use that expertise in whatever positional power you have to spark a new idea, to lead on different ways of shifting when we can get this this burden down to. And our board asked a question. They said, we want to ponder and sit with, is every burdensome process inequitable? And they're going to be sitting with that. And I'm hoping that they'll write something and tell us kind of where they land as a group of practitioners who are at foundations. I think that's important. But the key is, you know what you do. You know what's difficult. You know the questions you get from nonprofits. Take that back to the group and just try to do one or two things different, better. Go read up on the PDC. Go look at the work that Candid is leading around Data 1X, around demographics. For Candid, these are important tools. They are a group of them, and we will give to the organizers maybe a few helpful links for you all to refer back to. But I think, Julie, what you said as someone who's a philanthropic advisor, you're always sourcing information, right? You're always trying to find the right nonprofit to align with mission for the donors that are trying to move money out. And so I do think that maybe philanthropic advisors has something to share with all of us, which is you got to do the work. It's not up always for the nonprofit to try to find you and get through your barriers. The funders and philanthropic institutions and people within the sector, we have to be encouraging nonstop that we built the walls, we can break them down. And by breaking them down, we actually are moving toward more equity, more racial equity, because poverty lies at the heart of so many things, especially here in the US, which impacts more Black and brown folks. You're actually advancing racial equity, if you really think about it, when you are moving to more equitable practices. And that's why I think the three of us are so aligned so quickly on this work and can come together, because we really do believe we have responsibility, but we actually have a ton of opportunity right now. So I want to give you all just a couple seconds. Any last words that you would like to share before we close out our session? Oh, wait, there's another question. Wait. As you're thinking, okay, so this is a great question, because I know that we're all taking this up. Do you all recommend, if anyone is unable to read the question, do you all recommend switching to oral applications or only oral reporting? I've heard some argue that oral applications do a disservice to the sector because written communication isn't going away. Is it instead more important to focus on making written applications more concise and accessible in other ways? If I can just say, you can do many things. It's not just a one size fits all. We should not do that. Philanthropies are not monoliths. Nonprofits are not monoliths. I think that when you've built a relationship, what I would say, if I were giving you advice and you were paying Peak as one of our clients, I would say you have relationships with certain folks. If you're treating people that you've been funding for multiple years like you just met them, you should ask yourself, why can't you go to less burdensome processes like having an oral report like we just had with the Bar Foundation? They've been funding us for multiple years. They know us. They come to our stuff. They see us. Jim Canales knows us. We could do an oral report. It's not always where you will start, but definitely with a little bit of relationship and time in, you can get there. And so the whole disservice, because I know that John Palfrey has some notes about that. What's in writing is not always used. The data is not always used for decision making. So yes, it's in writing, but it's not always used for decision making. So just mind that. Are you using what becomes written? So Anne May and John, if you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, to me, it's not about whether it's oral or written. It's about the amount of information you're asking for. Like, ask for less information, for common information, get it from the website, get it from the Candid profile, and just ask for less. And then it doesn't matter as much how you get that less information. Just ask for the essential information you need that really is unique to you as a funder. And that should be relatively small, hopefully.
This is great. John, last word.
I think there's one last slide. So I wanted to mention that. So this is relative to the PDC. We've got a town hall coming up.
Excellent. Stuart, if you can flash that last slide for us. Thank you.
If anyone is interested, we'd love to have you join and attend. You mentioned the website. That's available if people are interested in more information. The pilot I mentioned is concluding at the end of this year, and then we'll be sharing out a report about that in early next year.
Excellent. Yeah, we will make sure, if we're not able to see the last slide, we'll make sure that we get that link and that invitation out to all of our participants. And so with that, we just thank you so much for your time and for selecting this session. We hope you found something that we said to be inspiring. We are all available. Our contact information is on Hopin, and we are available to talk to you at any time. And thank you. Julie's just posted the philanthropy-data-commons.org. Appreciate you, Julie. You can always find the advisors because they are on it. So I appreciate you. And thank you, Anne May. Thank you, John. Keep doing what you're doing, and even more. We're really inspired by the work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thanks all of you. Pleasure to be on the panel with you.
This was great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Upswell team. Everyone take care.
Bye-bye.